When you hear the word Rome, what comes to mind? Glorious temples, mighty armies, marble columns that still stand today. The birthplace of laws that shaped whole civilizations. Sounds impressive, right? But that's only the glossy postcard version. Because Rome had another face. A darker one. A place where human life was cheap. And death wasn't the end, it was entertainment. Think about it for a second. In Rome, death was staged like a play. The body stopped belonging to the person, it belonged to the crowd. It became part of the show. And that's the Rome we're going to talk about today. Not the city of triumphal arches, but the Rome where the arena was a death machine. Where thousands of voices cheered for cruelty. And once the games ended, the city itself was left haunted by the remains of what had just happened. Writers of the time said that, during the big festivals, Rome literally turned into a capital of death. Even the philosopher Seneca admitted, people don't want battles, they want deaths. And some stories from those arenas are so shocking, even now they're hard to wrap your head around. Like the tale of a boy forced to play Icarus. But we'll get to that later. First, let's step inside the arena itself. Because there, Rome showed its truest and ugliest face. Picture the Roman arena. Tens of thousands of people in the stands, shouting, laughing, drinking wine, tossing grapes into their mouths. And right in front of them? A place where death itself was put on stage. Now, if you open a schoolbook, gladiator fights are painted as something noble. Brave warriors, honor, glory. But the truth? It wasn't glorious at all. The arena wasn't about heroism. It was about cruelty. It worked like a machine that fed on human suffering. The sand underfoot soaked up death so often, it had to be scraped away and replaced. And anyone could end up there. Slaves, prisoners of war, even women. No one volunteered. They were simply thrown in, raw material for the crowd's amusement. To keep the audience entertained, Rome staged executions like plays. They copied myths. Orpheus set upon by wild animals. Hercules consumed by fire. And Icarus, pushed from a tower, crashing down in front of a roaring crowd. That story is especially chilling. Because some sources say it wasn't always grown men forced into that role. Sometimes it was boys, children, made to play Icarus. And thousands watched. We've covered that in another video. The boy from the arena. It's one of the darkest chapters in the entire history of Rome's theater of death. When the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, Emperor Titus celebrated with games that lasted 100 days. Over 5,000 animals and countless people died in those shows. As the historian Cassius Dio put it, the people don't want battles, they want death. And believe it or not, there were even darker scenes. Some victims weren't even able to fight. They were sent out crippled, already broken, just to suffer in front of a laughing crowd. To make it worse, the animals were starved beforehand, driven mad with hunger before they were released. What followed was chaos. Screams. The roar of the beasts. And above it all, applause. That was the atmosphere of the Roman games. Noise, smoke, the stench of burning, and thousands of voices celebrating death. And the terrifying truth? This was just the beginning. Here's the thing, the most terrifying part wasn't what happened inside the arena. It was the people who sat around it. To us, it looks like pure horror. But to the Romans? It was a holiday. A family day out. Men, women, children, everyone came to watch people die in the sand. Picture it, a crowd of tens of thousands. Some drinking wine. Some tearing into roasted meat. And right in front of them, someone's last breath. No one turned away. Because for them, it was entertainment. Gladiators were more than fighters. They were stars. Women wrote them love letters. They were the sex symbols of their time, celebrities who had just cut someone down in the arena. And the children? They grew up with this. Death in the sand was as normal to them as cartoons are to us today. They laughed, they cheered, it was part of their childhood. The crowd wasn't just watching. They had power. One gesture, the thumb. And the arena decided, live or die. Sometimes the emperor himself turned to the crowd. And tens of thousands shouted back in unison. Live! Or die! A single voice was nothing, but together, they decided who would walk away. And then there were the emperors who took things even further. Caligula, bored, plucked random spectators from the front rows and tossed them into the arena. Commodus? He stepped into the sand himself, killing animals and even unarmed men to prove he was the new Hercules. It wasn't just sport anymore. It was a raw display of power over life and death. And the kids? They copied what they saw. They built their own little arenas, acting out the violence with dolls, just as naturally as children today act out fairy tales. In Rome, death wasn't just shown. It was discussed, anticipated, enjoyed. Every spectator became part of the machinery. And when the applause finally stopped, death didn't leave with the crowd. It stayed behind. It lived in the city itself. The crowd goes home. The shouts fade. The arena is empty. But one question always hangs in the air: what about the bodies? Every single day after the fights, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds, of the dead. And it wasn't just gladiators. It was convicts, slaves, sometimes even bystanders caught up in the show. And what happened to them? They were piled up, stripped of identity. No names. No rituals. No dignity. Most of the time, they went straight into mass graves. Dozens tossed together, like garbage. Ancient writers even suggested that sometimes, not everyone was fully dead. But no one bothered to check. Cassius Dio claimed that during the Grand Games, as many as 10,000 people could die in a single day. Historians today doubt the number, but the very fact he wrote it down tells you how enormous the scale was. Pliny the Elder added his own haunting line. The pits are overflowing, and the dead are crowding the dead. And when plague struck, there wasn't even time to dig. Bodies were left in the streets. Rome's narrow alleys turned into open-air morgues. The dead beside the living, and people walked past as if it were nothing unusual. The smell of death hung over the city like a constant fog. You couldn't escape it. On the days of the Great Games, it was so thick that even temple incense couldn't drown it out. Chroniclers wrote, Rome had become a city of death. When there were too many bodies, they burned them in piles. And smoke, thick and bitter, rolled across the rooftops. Romans even joked darkly, "The empire is celebrating a feast." That was the contrast. For the audience, the games ended with cheers and laughter. For the city, they left behind nothing but silence, smoke, and death. Because in Rome, death wasn't an exception. It was everywhere. It lived with the people. And yet, even in death, there was a difference. The poor were treated one way. The rich, quite another. And even that, in its own way, became a show. In Rome, even death had its own hierarchy. If you were poor, your fate was simple. A mass grave. Dozens thrown together, burned in heaps. With no names, no markers, no memory. But if you were rich, your story looked very different. Your body rested in a sarcophagus, inside a grand mausoleum, surrounded by marble, gold, and inscriptions about eternity. It was meant to show wealth and greatness. But here's the truth. The body doesn't care about marble or gold. It decays the same way, in a pit or in a palace. The only difference? The spectacle. Sometimes the process was so fast. The sarcophagi themselves started to betray their illusion. The air inside built up pressure. Cracks appeared. And in some cases, the lid literally burst open. Whole neighborhoods caught the stench. The physician Galen warned. The vapors of dead bodies are more harmful than fire or poison. And Romans really believed it. They feared the air. Believing the smell itself carried sickness or a curse. Those grand mausoleums, built as monuments of eternal peace, turned into places of dread. People stayed away because they reeked of death. And when the stone leaked, dark, foul liquid seeped out. Romans gave it a chilling name: the juice of the dead. They thought that if it touched you, it meant death was coming sooner. And that's the cruel irony. Even the richest couldn't buy a beautiful ending. Marble and gold promised eternity. But the body always won. In Rome, death didn't distinguish between rich and poor. It came for all. And the most haunting part: it was never private. Even in death, Rome turned the body into a public show. In Rome, death didn't mean silence. It didn't mean peace. It meant a show. In the arena, lives ended for the crowd's applause. In the streets, bodies piled up as a grim reminder that Rome never escaped death, not even after the celebration. And in the mausoleums of the rich, even the graves themselves betrayed their promise of peace. Everything was public. Everything was a spectacle. Think about it. This was a civilization that gave us roads, laws, architecture that still stands today. And yet, it also turned death into its biggest theater. In Rome, the body didn't get to stay silent. It was forced to speak. Through screams. Through presence. Through suffering. Even when life itself was already slipping away. That was the empire's true face. Not just marble columns and legal codes. Not just armies and triumphs. But also a death machine, where life was cheap, and death was entertainment. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote about virtue, about dignity, about respect for human beings. And his son, Commodus, walked into the arena himself, killing animals and helpless men, showing the world how far Rome had sunk into the theater of death. That contrast says it all, from the philosophy of virtue to the spectacle of cruelty. This is the legacy Rome left us. Yes, it gave the world architecture and law. But it also showed how death could be staged, savored, and consumed as entertainment. And that's the most frightening part. Rome proved that even after death, the body could still be forced to play one last role. Rome gave us its laws, its monuments, its arenas. And in the end, it was the arenas that spoke the loudest. Because when the empire finally fell, what lingered was not just the stone it left behind, but the memory that Rome turned death itself into theater.